Maybe you've heard it said, it's not fair. It's not fair. And sometimes it's not fair. You know, the great controversy issue that we as Adventists particularly have insight on, it goes back to the fact that there was a time when sin arose in the being that God put all of his creative energy that he could put into a being. And this being decided that God wasn't fair. That God, in fact, was unjust and not doing the right thing. And God would have to allow events to occur in such a way to clearly, without controversy, demonstrate that these accusations against him were not true, but in fact revealed the very character of the one making the accusations against him. As it says in Romans chapter 2 and verse 1, we so often accuse others of the things that we ourselves are most guilty of. Injustice can be found in varying degrees of intensity in every area of human relations. It produces exploitation, it produces suffering, both mental and physical, emotional. But friends, God has a plan. He has a plan to fix this. God is not unmindful of the injustice going on in our world. In fact, the more I read the Bible and look for this, the more I find that God is not only extremely aware, but wants to deal with it. I'd like to begin by saying that injustice occurs in many places, but you know, one of the places that we find in not only the biblical record, but we see in everyday life, is injustice occurs within families. Within families. Today, when people reach the golden years of white hair and walking canes, they have what we call, at least in America, something called Social Security. And in many cases, some kind of retirement fund, such as 401k, or a similar savings plan to cover their expenses when they get older. But of course, it's not always been like that. Not only in America, but in many parts of the world, there are no such plans to provide for the physical needs of someone when they are older. The person's retirement plan in olden days and in many other parts of the world, their pension, if you please, is the children. Their children. One reason sometimes people have children in other societies is to make sure there's someone to take care of them when they are older. In the time of Jesus, there was a problem. There was a problem where the parents were not being cared for by children as they should have been. And we read about this in Mark chapter 7. We'll be reading Mark chapter 7, verses 9 through 13 here. Mark 7, 9 through 13. And Jesus is speaking, and he said unto them, Full well ye reject the commandment of God, that ye may keep your own tradition. For Moses said, Honor thy father and thy mother, and whosoever curses father or mother, let him die the death. But ye say, If a man shall say to his father or mother, It is Corban, that is to say, a gift, by whatsoever thou mightest be profited by me, he shall be free. And ye suffer him no more to do aught for his father or his mother, making the word of God of none effect through your tradition, which ye have delivered, and many such like things ye do. Now, the word Corban that is used here is a Hebrew word which Mark has transliterated, and he explains it as referring to a gift, and that's what the Hebrew word referred to, as a gift or an offering to God. You see, the rabbis in that day, they would allow the individual to keep whatever money should have been given by the son for the support of his parents. And if he would simply declare it a gift for God, he could withhold that money by merely speaking the word Corban, and this would justify his withholding it from the parents. This was in defiance, direct defiance of God's command by which a son is required to honor his parents by providing for their necessities whenever they were in need. But he could declare this, use it for himself, and then when he died, it would go into the temple service. he didn't need it anymore. It was certainly an injustice by these children to their parents who had treated them so well, raising them, and had labored so lovingly to provide for them when they were younger. But you know, the Bible speaks not only about the children, but also about parents, especially fathers, not showing justice to their children. In the book of Ephesians, in chapter 6 and verse 4, we read here, Paul writes, "And ye fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord." He says, don't provoke your children to wrath. Why would Paul have to say that? Because it was being done. Because it is easy for fathers, maybe more so than mothers, to provoke children to wrath, but mothers can do it too. Mothers can do it too. Martin Luther tells the story of one time he stole a nut, single, and his mother beat him till the blood ran. And he had some resentment about that. He had been provoked, if you please, to wrath. In Colossians chapter 3, Paul repeats similar counsel here. He says in Colossians 3:21, "Fathers, provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged." That can happen. It can happen so easily. There was a young man who had been sent on an errand by his parents, and he was driving his father's car to a location to do an errand for his father. He wasn't acting stupid, he wasn't acting brash, but somehow an accident happened. The car rolled, and there was an accident. Fortunately, the son was not hurt, but his father, whom he loved dearly, expelled him from the house for having the accident. An accident in which he could have been killed in. And instead of holding him and reassuring him of his love and care, he was ordered to leave the house. We might say that kind of a thing was an injustice. Injustice occurs within our larger communities, outside of our families as well. In Isaiah 59 and verses 14 and 15, Isaiah 59 verses 14 and 15, it says, "And judgment is turned away backward, and justice standeth afar off. For truth is fallen in the street." When it says truth is fallen, it's like it's fallen down, it's died, it's no longer able to stand, it has no viable life in it. "For truth is fallen in the street, and equity cannot enter. Yea, truth faileth, and he that departeth from evil maketh himself a prey. And the Lord saw it, and it displeased him that there was no judgment." You see, friends, God sees it, doesn't he? And God, I want to assure you, is not happy about it. There were in ancient times, as today, people who would defraud to try to obtain property. We see this today all the time. But in Deuteronomy chapter 19 and verse 14, God gave special counsel because he knew this would be a problem. "Thou shalt not remove thy neighbor's landmark, which they of old time have set in thine inheritance, which thou shalt inherit in the land that the Lord thy God giveth thee to possess it." Those landmarks of where the land properties and boundaries were very important to those people. And in Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 28, again we are reminded, "Remove not the ancient landmark which thy fathers have set." Now, God wasn't trying to make the people selfish, but he was trying to keep them from being selfish toward others. And if someone had some land and they had maybe some vineyards on it, or they had crops on it, and if you were going through that land, if you were hungry, you had the full right and the permission of God to partake of that food when you were hungry, but not for your future hunger, if I may. For instance, in Deuteronomy chapter 23 and verses 24 and 25, he says, "When thou comest into thy neighbor's vineyard, then thou mayest eat grapes to fill at thine own pleasure, but thou shalt not put any in thy vessel." So if you're going through and you're hungry, you could eat, but don't put any in for the future. It says, "When thou comest into the standing corn of thy neighbor, then thou mayest pluck the ears with thine hand, but thou shalt not move a sickle unto thy neighbor's standing corn." Do you remember the story of Ahab and he found a place that he wanted to make an herb garden, and it belonged to Naboth. Remember? And Naboth said, "No, I can't give this to you because this is my ancestors." He remembered those statements about the boundaries and the landmarks. And Ahab, the crybaby, went home and cried to Jezebel. And Jezebel said, "Well, quit acting like a baby. Be a man about this. I'll get it for you." And she contrived to have Naboth murdered. Friends, God saw that injustice. You know the story. This is the very location where Elijah the prophet met Ahab to pronounce doom upon him. You can read about it in 1 Kings 21. Injustices occur routinely in the business world today. I think of the plight of the coal miners in West Virginia. If you'd went back 100, 120 years, you would have found miners working under the most terrible conditions. Even young children, 10, 11, 12 years old, going and working into the mines. Some of them that were older would go into the mines. Some of them that were younger would be outside on the conveyor belts, sorting the rocks out from the coal, and they were receiving pennies to do this work, and created all this tension. In Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 35, God says, "Ye shall do no unrighteousness in judgment, in meat yard, in weight, or in measure." Whatever business dealings you're dealing with, he says, you are to be fair. Have you ever heard the expression, and please forgive me if I'm politically incorrect now, but have you ever heard the expression, he's going to Jew him about it? He's going to Jew him? He Jewed him? You know, and we say that because rightfully or wrongfully, the Jewish people have gained a reputation as being sharp dealers. But I want to tell you the truth is that there's no one who's a sharper dealer than Seventh-day Adventist people. We out-Jew the Jew. I tell you the truth. And we want all the best for us at the expense of someone else, because after all, we think we are God's darling. We deserve it. But friends, God causes his sun and rain to shine and to come upon the just and the unjust. He loves them all. He wants them all in his kingdom. When you go to buy a car, when you're making a deal on a house, when you're buying anything that requires negotiation, friends, you should try to negotiate something that's fair and right. Don't negotiate for what is the best you can get, but what is fair for you and fair for others. In Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 1, Proverbs 11:1, he says, "A false balance is abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight." And then I think of the text also that speaks about the man who says, it is not, and then he goes and tells someone else, "Oh, look at this great thing I got," you know. He goes to the flea market and says, "Oh, it's not that good," and he buys it cheap, and then he goes and says, "Look at this great thing I just bought." Yeah, that's right. And I also want to tell you that injustice occurs so oftentimes in courts of law. In courts of law. In Proverbs chapter 24, Proverbs again, and verses 23 and 24, God says, "These things also belong to the wise. It is not good to have respect of persons in judgment. He that saith unto the wicked, Thou art righteous, him shall the people curse, nations shall abhor him." When someone pronounces the guilty innocent, or says, "Oh, you're a good guy, you deserve this, or you can have that," it says the people will abhor that kind of a judge. They will see the hypocrisy, and nations even will abhor him. The prophet Amos, in the Old Testament, Amos chapter 5 and verse 12, he says, "For I know your manifold transgressions and your mighty sins. They afflict the just, they take a bribe, and they turn aside the poor in the gate from their right." And you know, friends, there's more than one way to take a bribe. There's a lot of ways you can take a bribe. You can just be the friend of someone, and by doing them a favor, it's the same thing as taking a bribe from them, isn't it? I think about John Huss. Jan Hus. You know, think about him and the injustice that was done to Huss. In Great Controversy on page 104 in paragraph 4, we know that Huss had been called to a council and at Constance, and says Huss was conscious of the dangers which threatened him. He parted from his friends as if they were never to meet them again. as if he were never to meet them again, and went on his journey feeling that it was leading him to the stake. Was he right or wrong? He was right. He was right. Notwithstanding, he had obtained what? A safe conduct from the king of Bohemia, and received one also from the Emperor Sigismund. While on his journey, he made all his arrangements in view of the probability of his death. So get the picture. Huss has been teaching. He's bringing the Reformation, if you please, a little early to Bohemia. Bohemia was some of those provinces of Germany, what we today call Germany. And Huss was granted what was called a safe conduct. That meant that you could travel there safely, and when everything was done, you could leave and go back home safely. Now, once you got back home, things were different, but you at least had a safe conduct to and from. Well, we read on. It says, upon arriving at Constance, Huss was granted full liberty when he first got there. To the emperor's safe conduct was added a personal assurance of protection by the Pope. But in violation of these solemn and repeated declarations, the reformer was in a short time arrested by order of the Pope and cardinals and thrust into a loathsome dungeon. Later he was transferred to a strong castle across the Rhine and there kept a prisoner. Huss was, as we know, burnt at the stake. He never got to use that safe conduct to go home. The injustice done to this righteous man can hardly be calculated. But his life and even his death paved the way for Jerome to be faithful and to follow Huss in death to the stake. And a little more than 100 years later, this was going to be a history that would help keep Martin Luther alive. When Charles V was urged to handle Luther over to the church, i.e. the same as consigning him to the flames, we read about this in Great Controversy again on page 163.2. It says, he was still further urged, that is Charles V was urged by the most bitter of Luther's papal enemies to deal with the reformer as Sigismund had dealt with Huss, abandon him to the mercies of the church. But recalling the scene when Huss in public assembly had pointed to his chains and reminded the monarch of his plighted faith, Charles V declared, I should not like to blush like Sigismund. In other words, Sigismund was quite publicly embarrassed when Huss, who was in chains, said, you promised me a safeguard. You promised me safe passage, and you didn't give it to me. And Charles says, I don't want to blush like Sigismund did. In England, when the flames were kindled about Latimer and Rudley, Latimer said, Master Ridley, play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as shall never be put out. You see, friends, the Bible says in Romans chapter 8 and verse 28 that all things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose. And sometimes we see things happen like the burning of Huss at the stake, and we think this was a great tragedy. And yet God used that injustice for the just of his cause. When Latimer and Ridley were burned at the stake, it did, to a great degree, serve as an illumination to light England and that area. The apostles, they suffered injustice and persecution. You remember the story of Paul and Silas when they had went to Philippi and they had been preaching, and then they were put in prison, and then there was a great earthquake and they were let out. And when the magistrates heard what happened, well, let's read about here in Acts 16, verses 36 and 37. It says, and the keeper of the prison told this, saying to Paul, the magistrates have sent to let you go. Now therefore depart and go in peace. But Paul said unto them, they have beaten us openly uncondemned, being Romans, and have cast us into prison. And now do they thrust us out privily? Nay, verily, but let them come themselves and fetch us out. Paul putting them on the spot, you might say. First of all, we were uncondemned. Secondly, we were Romans. You just did not. You don't understand what it meant to be a Roman citizen in those days. Cinemus Romanus, that's all it took. And you were protected. You could go throughout that whole empire, and no one dared lay a finger on you because you were a Roman citizen, because they knew what the retribution of Rome would mean. Don't tell me that deterrents don't have an effect. They certainly do. But all of the apostles, all of the prophets, almost all of them, suffered in just ways of some kind or another. In Isaiah chapter 10 and verses 1 and 2, we read here about injustice being caused by rulers and governments. And he says here in Isaiah chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees, and that write grievousness which they have prescribed, to turn aside the needy from judgment, and to take away the right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey, and that they may rob the fatherless. These poor needy ones, these ones who have no one else to protect them. What little protection you should have been, you've taken away from them. Now, the greatest injustice ever was the condemnation and execution of Jesus Christ. The procurator Pilate, Pontius Pilate, in Matthew 27 and verse 24, says, when Pilate saw that he could prevail nothing, but that rather a tumult was made, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this just person, see ye to it. What did he call him? He called Jesus a just person. A just person. Pilate knew in John chapter 19 and verse 4, Pilate therefore went forth again and saith unto them, behold, I bring him forth to you, that ye may know that I find no fault in him. But for the expediency of his position, the politicalness of the cause, Pilate condemned this just man in whom was no fault. Pilate well knew the injustice of it all. He had been warned by his wife in a dream. King David was a fugitive from Saul, unjustly hunted down like an animal. And yet, when he had the opportunity to slay Saul, on 2 different occasions, he refused to pick up his hand against the one whom he called the Lord's anointed. And even when Saul was later destroyed on the battlefield, David lamented the death of Saul, and especially Jonathan, and even wrote a beautiful song about them. He loved Saul and mourned his death, and he even dealt harshly with the one who just claimed to have killed Saul. The Bible is full of the just being treated unjustly. But friends, God has a plan. God has a plan. In Psalms 101 and verse 5, and we saw earlier that God knows about this injustice. It doesn't pass his eye. You would think with all the multiple injustices, surely God must not be aware. But God says, I see everything. I know it all. And it says here, whoso privily slandereth his neighbor, him will I cut off. Him that hath an high look and a proud heart will I not suffer. Now we know that the Bible says that because of God's mercy, sometimes he delays judgment a long time. But friends, God will deal with the injustice. In Proverbs 23, verses 10 and 11, again another text about the landmarks, and he says, remove not the old landmark, and enter not into the fields of the fatherless, for their Redeemer is mighty. He shall plead their cause with thee. God plans to plead our cause, friends, when injustice comes. God hates the injustice. In Proverbs chapter 6, we have this list of 6 things, yea, 7 things, he says, that are an abomination to him. And notice what some of these are. I'm in Proverbs 6, reading now from verse 17. He says, a proud look, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood, and a heart that devises wicked imaginations. I need your help, honey. Need your help down there. A heart that devises wicked imaginations, feet that be swift in running to mischief, a false witness that speaketh lies, and he that soweth discord among his brethren. Almost all of these involve injustice of some kind. And God says, I hate these things. In Isaiah 63 and verse 4, we have a statement here that Paul quotes, and we'll see the quotation in the New Testament next. But he says, for the day of vengeance is in mine heart, and the year of my redeemed is come. God says he has vengeance in his heart even. And Paul making reference to this in Romans chapter 12 and verse 9. Romans chapter 12 and verse 9, he says, dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. You see, friends, we have the temptation to try to avenge injustice, to try to take vengeance ourselves, to try to fix situations that we know are wrong. But this is wrong to do this. That Prince of Preachers, Charles Spurgeon, he gave this illustration. He says there's a whole province in Holland protected from the sea by a dike. But here comes along a man who wants to let a little water into the other side for certain purposes. He says he's only going to let a little stream through, though. So he takes a pickaxe and he works away till he's made a passage through the dike. And then, of course, the whole dike is swept away. God forbid that I should be blamed for this catastrophic action. I never meant to do anything of the sort. Of course he didn't. He didn't intend for something far less than that, but his action naturally produced the result that followed, and therefore he is rightly regarded as responsible for it. And then Spurgeon says, here's the lesson. Beware, I ask you, of trifling with the eternal purposes of justice. Beware, he says, I ask you, of trifling with the eternal purposes of justice and of right and wrong. Beware of ever sanctioning what you consider only a little evil. A little evil. For if you do, the greater evil is sure to follow at its heels. It is like the boy that the burglar takes and pushes through a little window, that he may open the door and let in those who commit robbery and murder. Spurgeon finishes and he says, so if any of us begin to advocate principles that sap and undermine the foundations of law and order, we cannot tell to what mischief our talk will lead. It is well for us always to be careful not to sow the wind, lest we should by and by reap the whirlwind. There was a Protestant leader in the Netherlands in 1580 whose name was Claus, who was arrested and he was condemned as a heretic. Like others before him, Huss and Jerome, he was burnt at the stake. When the tragedy was over, though, his dear wife took their small son by the hand. They walked through the back streets to the hill where their loved one had perished as a Christian martyr. At the place of execution, this bereaved widow gathered up a few of the ashes that remained. She placed them in her satchel and hung it around her boy's neck. And she said this to him. She says, son, I placed these ashes on your heart and on the heart of every son of these Netherlands in all eternity. Whenever and wherever in this world there is an injustice or wrong committed, these ashes will beat on your heart and you will speak out without fear, even at the fear of death. There is a place to speak out against injustice, absolutely. But we are not to take justice into our own hands. We are to be, as it were, God's mouthpiece against injustice. But God is the one who must ultimately deal with it. Paul, who was going to be executed by an unjust government for unjust things, could write in his last epistle, in 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 8, he could say, Henceforth, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, now notice what he says, the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day, and not to me only, but unto all them also that love his appearing. Paul says, I'm going to be executed. My time is up. I'm not guilty of anything. That's been clear. You know, even Agrippa said he could have been freed if he hadn't appealed to Rome. That was the first time, but this is later. But nevertheless, unjust. But he says, the Lord, the righteous judge. And he will recompense me at that day as he will all others also who love him. Finally, my brethren, how do we relate to those who are unjust toward us? In the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus lays out very specifically how we are to relate. Matthew chapter 5, verse 43 and 44, Jesus said, ye have heard that it hath been said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thy enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies. What did he say to do? Love your enemies. You are to love your enemies. You are to love your enemies. Bless them that curse you, whether they curse you with words or actions. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them that hate you, that don't respond to your texts and calls and things like that. And pray for them which despitefully use you, especially your loved ones, and persecute you. Now, why would God ask us to do this? This seems so hard. This seems so wrong. Why does God ask us to do this? Well, in the next verses he tells us, in verse 45, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. That's why we do it. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust. For if ye love them which love you, what reward have ye? Do not even the publicans the same? And if ye salute your brethren only, what do ye more than others? Do not even the publicans so? Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. We talk about perfection a lot in Adventism, don't we? We talk about this last generation theology, perfection of character, living in the sight of a holy God without a mediator. We quote Matthew 5:48 a lot, but the context of Matthew 5:48 is about having a perfection that loves even our enemies, a perfection that cares for even those who despitefully use us and persecute us. You know, I hope that this message today touches someone's heart. I hope it helps someone out there. I'll confess to you quite freely, I preached this message for myself today. I needed this message today. And I needed these words today. And I hope that they've helped you some. And I'd just like to share one other statement that is a little in connection with what we're doing. And it just resonated with me. Because one thing we need to keep in mind is that sometimes we have differences. We feel like someone has done us wrong, even our brother or sister. And sometimes they may not mean to do that. But I found this statement and it spoke to my heart, and I just want to share it with you. It's from the Review and Herald of April 8, 1902, the very first paragraph. That's Review and Herald of April 8, 1902, paragraph 1. Many things that do not now appear in a correct light will be made plain in the day of God. And I like that, first of all, because there's things that we don't understand now. We don't get why, God, are you allowing this to happen? It'll be made plain. Maybe when Huss was being burnt at the stake, he couldn't understand why. But God will make it plain to him one day. There is never a time when it is right for you or me to say, I will not forgive my brother. I will not walk in fellowship with him. You know, I mentioned at camp meeting a story that I personally knew of a man who said, I will never worship man's feet. I will never be a brother to that man. You know, he felt he'd been offended or something was wrong. But listen to what it says. There is never a time when it is right for you or me to say, I will not forgive my brother. I will not walk in fellowship with him. He who does this places himself in opposition to the teachings of Christ. If your brother does an injustice ignorantly and then holds out The hand of fellowship saying, if I've erred and done you an injury, forgive me. And you draw away from him, refusing to forgive. You walk away from the great counselor and need yourself to repent and be forgiven. So let us be sure, friends, that if we are on the wrong end of an injustice, that we don't do an even greater injustice by being unwilling to forgive. That's all I have to say today. I hope it's been a blessing, and I hope that you will use these words in the future and now. You're certainly going to need them. They will be applicable, I promise.